Welcome to Our Dyke Histories. I'm your host, Jack Easking, historian, geographer, and environmental psychologist. We dive into the past and present of les, queer, trans, sapphic, MB communities decade by decade in collaboration with multicultural lesbian literary and art journal Sinister Wisdom. This season, we're all about dyke bars, with an asterisk. Lesbian bars, queer parties, and trans hangouts. The structures that made them necessary, the lives they made possible, and the worlds we made from them. Our Dyke Histories. Come for the history, stay for the revolution, gossip, and desire that built us. Welcome back. In this part 2 of season 1, we are switching into high gear 80s and thereafter about the history of queer nightlife. I'm so excited to talk about super parties, what actually is a queer archives, and finally answering that age-old question, why do or don't lesbians cruise? Today we're especially talking about the US in the 80s and the 90s in conversation with the incredible Lucas Hilderbrand. We're going to go from an actually fascinating Boston all the way to St. Louis, LA, New York City, and the clitoris of America. You know it and may love it too. San Francisco. Let's meet our truly fabulous guest.
Hi, I'm Lucas Hilderbrand. I'm chair and professor of film and media studies at the University of California, Irvine, and the author of The Bars Are Ours, Histories and Cultures of Gay Bars in America, 1960 and After.
This book has such a big scope since the 1960s till today, and we're going to especially talk about the dyke trans parts of it, particularly in the 80s, the 90s, and the moment of queerness, which is incredibly cool. I thought we would start with, how did you even imagine this book? How did you do this history?
So it really started from a recognition that no book that was national in scope on gay bars or queer spaces like this existed, and it just seemed like something that should exist. I'd finished my first book, and all of my adult life up into that moment had been lived in cities where I went to bars all the time and had a sense of an urban public life through nightlife. I spent about 15 years working on it, and it was primarily an archival project, and it took a number of years to figure out what kind of documentation existed and where to find those materials. I would just seek out whatever collections I could find. The archivist would often bring me collections of matchbooks or gay travel guides. There were listings that may have indicated leather bar, drag bar, lesbian bar, sort of types of bars, but there were no stories. There was no sort of sense of the experience of these places. There's very little like actual documentation beyond sort of visual ephemera or listings. But those listings, they might indicate if it was a leather bar, a lesbian bar, a drag bar, but they wouldn't say anything more than that. Occasionally there would be photos, but I wouldn't know who was in them, what year they were, or what bar they were in. So
Totally, the life of a queer archivist. When
exactly,
was this? Where is
exactly.
it?
Like,
Yes.
what is this? What is this?
Looks
It looks
fun.
interesting and fabulous, and you can sort of tell who was hot back in the day or not, but
Yes.
or who was the life of the party, or who the photographer had a crush on.
Yeah.
But there weren't the stories.
If you're listening, you are also a story lover. Being in a queer archives, what Lucas is talking about is actually finding that intimacy, that understanding of a person or a place. I have been to dozens of queer archives around the world, and they often have a similar smell, which is old paper. They are filled with innumerable boxes, which aim to prevent the further degradation of various materials. The archives I spent the most time in is the Lesbian Herstory Archives. And it's a very unique place because it's in a brownstone, which is a 3-story, gorgeous house. And the LHA probably houses some of the most diverse types of collections. There's a massive button collection, a t-shirt collection. You can walk past somebody's dildo next to their Gay Games medal on a sink upstairs. There are boxes of amazing people like Audre Lorde, Barbara Smith, Adrienne Rich, and you could just take down their box and touch them. The Lesbian Herstory Archives has a policy of actually touching the materials. What's great about going to archives is you are so welcome there. Archivists are super nerdy and they would love to have you. They would love to show you, their slings, their dildos. They're originally signed Alison Bechdel Comics. And when you're in an archives, you're really trying to find those stories. But for Lucas, he found one source that was more important than any other.
It was really by spending time with the gay press, and I would say the golden age of there was a period from about the 70s through the 90s where every major city had an actual gay newspaper, not just the free magazines that were at the bar with pictures and ads in them, but there's like actual journalism with actual reporting and political coverage and debate and commentary. And the gay press was really symbiotic with the bars because they relied upon the bars for advertising and for distribution, because that's when there's reporting that actually tells these stories. And it's sort of this golden age of gay journalism, which has largely been forgotten. There's a struggle to bring them to print. Many of the chapters manifest because there would be a flurry of reporting around a particular issue at a particular moment in a particular city that allowed me to tell a story.
Yeah, so it strikes me with the matchbooks and the locations, you would just have a bunch of dots on a map,
Correct.
but it's so
Yeah.
humanizing to get the stories out of the press. And this Boston chapter is the 70s and the
Yeah.
80s, like to think about gentrification going back then and to not have another story about New York. I mean, it's shocking that Boston is where it's at,
Yeah.
always to me. But yeah,
Yeah.
God us bless them.
So, for instance, the question of gentrification happens through Boston, which wasn't my expectation. It's just that's where I found the most robust, the earliest, and actually the most radical and sort of class solidarity, empathetic championing of the lumpen proletariat, of our trans sisters, of sex workers, were really central to this discourse of sort of gay homeowners versus queer people who claimed rights to public space. When you go to the queer archives, or sometimes there's individual collections at a university or at the public library, and you never know what you're going to find in the queer archive, and that's part of what makes the archive queer. Uh, but also, sort of
Well said.
whose papers become included is at times really fascinating and oftentimes insightful to history in ways you don't expect. University of Texas San Antonio, there's a collection of women business owners papers. So one of the collections there is for a bar owner named Lolly Johnson, and her materials, and she owned a series of gay and lesbian venues in the 70s and 80s. And among her materials is a folio of the business cards that she had, and among them are things like exterminators, restaurant supply, carpet cleaning. So things that are really mundane, but it's the infrastructure that sustains a business that we don't even think about when we think about the culture of gay bars. For instance, if you don't have an exterminator, you're going to violate the health codes and be shut down. So these things that we don't really
Mm-hmm.
think about as being part of the story actually are part of the story. It's not just about vice raids or zoning or the liquor licensing that have a homophobic politics.
Yeah. Can you get fire insurance? We're always thinking about these big forces, but it's also, yeah,
Yeah.
as you say, in the everyday life of the
Right.
bar.
And with even printing the matchbooks, is you have to figure out which printer isn't homophobic that will actually produce your materials for you.
Like the Castro camera
E-
of Harvey Milk saying, we're going to print our own photos because you won't print photos of queer people.
exactly.
So we're going to print our own photos on the Castro. Right. So we have to make our own economy, not just because we want to buy queer, but no one's going to sell to us,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
there's a whole sort of
Mind
parallel or
blown.
sort of hidden infrastructure or history. One of my favorite things I found in any archive anywhere, there was a box that I opened it up and it had tissue paper. I opened up the tissue paper and it's a pair of clear vinyl disco shoes that were rhinestoned, and it's like, oh,
Ooh.
so she liked to dress up and dance sometimes maybe. And one of the things I really wanted to do was humanize this history and give it a texture that it felt lived and not just a history of vice raids and zoning, or sort of
Mm.
or this sort of understanding that was reductive in terms of who these bars were for and who they served. Because for me, it was really important to understand that these bars are really microcosms of ambivalence and human messiness. And the people who went to them
Amen.
Absolutely, sort of you could have a great night, you could have a terrible night, you could find love, you could be
Be bored
be
out of your
bored out of your
mind.
mind, you could be
Yeah.
heartbroken, you could be groped, you could be roofied. I mean, all these
hmm
things exist in these spaces. There's a full range of human experience that happens in them.
I got to tell you about Castro Camera. So in the 1970s, there were so many gay men and lesbians living in San Francisco. You're like, why? Why was it gay? How did these places become gay? What could it be? The reason that gay San Francisco really grows is there were so many queer and trans folks discharged from World War II from being gay or finishing out their time in World War II at the port city of, you guessed it, San Francisco. Also see Boston, LA, New York. Why would you go home again? You wouldn't. And hence, we have gay coastal cities. By the 1970s, there's such a huge population of gay men, and a lot of them are middle class making money, and they want to buy stuff. They want to go to a liquor store. They want to buy their antiques. They want to get their photos developed, but their photos contain gay people. Local camera stores were denying them the ability to do that. So they built their own economy. And Harvey Milk opened Castro Cameras. And it was also a way of claiming and making space. If you're not going to serve us, we're going to make our own world. If you're not going to represent us, we're going to elect our own politicians. If you can't handle our culture, we're going to make our culture bigger and brighter with more sequins, more boas, and more flannel than you've ever seen before. Harvey Milk in 1977 was the first openly gay elected candidate to office in the US. This is a massive queer infrastructure, and Harvey Milk and Castro Camera were so central there and in so many other places, including St. Louis, Missouri.
So there was another collection at University of Missouri, Kansas City, which is fabulously named the Glamma Collection, the Gay and Lesbian Archive of Mid-America. So they had a set of collections around these female impersonator lounges and drag bars. And I don't think it's the expectation of most people who might pick up the book, but it was actually the biggest collection of materials that I found about drag and female impersonation. And so I found archival collections about these two venues that happened to also be where Esther Newton had done field research for Mother Camp, which was...
Oh, we should explain who Esther Newton is to our listeners.
Yeah. So Esther Newton is a landmark anthropologist who really did probably one of the first in-community anthropological studies of queer spaces and gender that became foundational to queer studies and queer theory afterwards. This was research done in the mid-1960s and was really one of the first, if not the first, true queer studies texts. And it's one of these things where I think I'd probably read the book years before and didn't realize she had done research in Kansas City until after I was in the archive, and I was like, wait a minute.
Esther Newton, now a phenomenal dog breeder and competitor with her tiny dogs. She provided a picture of what gay life was way before Stonewall. As she put it in the documentary recently released about her, I was saying gays are a group and a proper subject for anthropology.
So one of the collections in this archive are the personal papers of a cocktail waitress from a drag lounge who worked at the female impersonator lounge and who clearly had a very loving relationship with the talent who performed there. Just the fact that that exists in an archive was amazing to me. There were letters from the performers who sort of had moved away or moved on. It reminds us of the range of people who sort of contribute to and sustain these kinds of spaces. From what I could tell, I inferred that she was a straight woman, but she was part of the community. It was like a very revered person in the community.
That's
and so she
cool.
had letters and signed photographs from the talent, and she had, things in her collection that no one else would have.
Right. I love this. I love that this woman is collecting our history for us. The inclusion of drag has long been central to the evolution and success of gay bars and even straight bars that performed sexual tourism for their voyeur viewers. It's interesting, too, to think about how this presumably straight woman who works in one of these spaces had the ability to save these materials for an archive. A lot of queer people did not keep their materials for fear of being found out. If And when they died, if no one knew they were gay, or even if they did, they often destroyed them. Before we go back to chatting with Lucas, it's important to also think, does St. Louis offer AIDS care in the 80s? I talk about this further in the episodes coming out with Sarah Schulman, Valerie Walker, and Catherine Forrest. But in the 80s, a lot of neighborhoods closed because they didn't have people who wouldn't support people living with AIDS. They just refused them. This is real. And so you wound up going to certain hospitals in certain cities for the possibility of survival. That said, let's get back to drag, the fun kind. So you said the word female impersonator for those listeners who haven't tuned into previous episodes. So at this period in time, drag queens, trans women are often referred to as female impersonators on stage, and trans masks or drag kings, however they identify, might be referred to as male impersonators.
So one of the things that I learned in working on the project is that people my age and younger, assume that drag was always part of the gay bar world. And that only really happens in the 60s. And what's fascinating is that there were two venues, one block apart, same owner, same talent. One was understood as a female impersonator cabaret or lounge for a straight tourist clientele, and the other was a drag bar for the gay community. And the juxtaposition of these two spaces revealed sort of that these two things meant different things and it had imagined two different audiences. It's in the 60s that we really transition from female impersonators doing these theatrical shows directed for straight audiences to drag really becoming a largely gay male cultural sort of form.
Next up, we're going to talk about party culture. Now, Lucas is going to argue that the super parties of San Francisco take off in the 90s. The idea of a super party that's a large interracial party for the first time in queer history is absolutely happening in the 90s in San Francisco. But as we'll talk about with Nikki Lane and Kemi Adeyemi about Black queer women's spaces, Black warehouse parties have been going on forever, because where can you actually gather that no one's going to bother you? An abandoned industrial space. And this goes back decades. And so you do have these super parties happening, but the interracial super party, publicly advertised, that's what Lucas is talking about, coming to us live in San Francisco in the 1990s. I love us skipping through time. One of the things that I'm very excited to talk about too is kind of queerness and how queerness changes. You have this incredible, mind-blowing chapter to me about San Francisco.
San Francisco was really, really fascinating to me because around 1988, there is suddenly a blossoming of parties that are distinct from everyday gay bars. So there's, on the one hand, a transition from the gay bar model to the party model, which is something that I think we still see. We also see a cultural and generational shift happening concurrently with this, happening in other cities, probably on a smaller scale. But San Francisco has this kind of explosion of public discourse about it. So both the Bay Area Reporter and the Sentinel, very prominent gay newspapers in the Bay Area, begin reporting on a generational divide, essentially between the baby boomers and Gen X, a generational shift. We see this phenomenon of these generational or even micro-generational desires to redefine nightlife as a way of claiming a generational identity or creating a sense of a scene or an identity for a community or a sense of a zeitgeist.
So like each generation like makes their own nightlife scene, and it's like I invented it, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And we've seen this cyclically. But what happens, particularly in the late 80s, is there's a clear kind of generational shift that happens between what might be called the sort of the AIDS generation, who come of age in the age of the AIDS epidemic, which has a fundamentally different sort of political, social, and sexual stakes and dynamic. There's a real sense of not understanding each other across those generational divides, but there's also a desire to reimagine nightlife.
One of the most eternal breakdowns within the queer community is the idea and recognition and frustration around generational differences. Like, why don't we get one another? Why don't we understand one another? I want to tell you a story about from my own research for A Queer New York. I did these multi-generational group interviews, and in one I had a woman who came out in the 80s, a woman who came out in the 90s, and a dyke who came out in the aughts. And they're sitting and having a chat, and the woman who came out in 1984, Gloria, says, well, then I was evicted, and keeps talking, and the woman from the 90s jumps in and says, wait, why were you evicted? And Gloria looks furious. She says, because I was gay. And the other two people apologized that they didn't know that that was a thing. So when these participants went off to talk in their next group interview with just people who came out around the same time in the 90s and the aughts, they both told the other participants in their interview, did you know we used to be evicted because we could be gay? And everyone said, I didn't know. And I said, I felt so embarrassed. How did I not know it? And I said, wait, I didn't know it. I'm doing the research and writing the book about it. I don't know either. I'm going to look it up. And when I finally got to talk to Gloria again, and she was talking with other 80s participants, I brought this up and I said, you got really angry, frustrated. I'm so sorry that happened. What were you thinking? And she said, I was thinking, these kids today think it's all like the L word. I assured her friends that the generation who came out in the aughts do not think it's all like the L word. But I did point out to everyone we interviewed that we just don't have access to our history. In fact, in 1987, New York City was the first place in the U.S. to pass anti-eviction laws based on sexual orientation. Until then, everywhere in the country, you could evict people for being gay. That was a legitimate reason. And that is harrowing. But the other coin about these generational shifts and misunderstandings and what I would call flat out breakdowns is that we come out in very different moments. There was a famous sociologist, Carl Mannheim, who theorized that people go through really major events in the course of their life, say World War II, and they become a generation together. You get the boomer generation. Totally makes sense. But when it comes to queer people, I theorized, and I wrote about in my book, that it actually matters when you come out. Imagine coming out in the 80s. All of a sudden, there's this mysterious disease. People are dying from it that you know every week. You're going to a funeral week. What's going on? That is a very different mindset than coming out under, say, President Obama. That you're told this total bullshit, vague message of it gets better, but there are queer youth groups in high schools. This is so different than, again, coming out in the 50s under McCarthyism. So if you're queer, trans, and listening to this, whenever you came out to yourself, to other people as queer, as LGBTQ, whenever you came into yourself and your body as a trans person, that moment really shapes you too. And sometimes that makes it hard to understand one another when, in part, we don't have access to our history, and then we're trying to talk to one another when we had very different experiences.
The key part is there's a real investment in reclaiming and reviving nightlife. So in the mid 80s, we can see a declension narrative of sort of the decline of nightlife, both because of the very, very real effects of the AIDS epidemic having massive casualties, but also people doing a lot of caretaking or people being afraid of being in public social and sexual
Absolutely.
spaces. That has a devastating effect on nightlife. But also, there's other things that have we've often forgotten about that moment. There were other elements that really transformed my understanding of that history that have been forgotten. So one of them is a national change of drinking age from 18 to 21. And that has a devastating effect on the financial prospects of gay bars. 18 to 21 are prime drinking years for a lot of people. And so that's a major
Yeah.
hit to revenues. And of course, some people are going to find fake IDs or sneak in or find ways in. But like, that's a major demographic or major market share that suddenly is lost overnight because of the campaign against drunk driving. Concurrently, insurance rates for gay bars skyrocket because they have new liabilities around drunk driving. If someone is at a bar, gets drunk, and drives home and kills themselves or someone else, the bars become liable for
Yeah.
serving them. So those things coupled with people not going out or being sick fundamentally changes
Yeah.
the scene.
Yeah, and in Last Call at Maud's, the documentary about the long term lesbian bar, they talk about so many people have joined AA, and NA and
Hmm.
OA,
Yes.
and it's really in the 80s we start to get LGBTQ AA meetings, and they spread like wildfire.
Yes.
In a queer New York, I had heard a lot from my lesbi queer trans participants who had come out between the 80s and the aughts to say, like, how do we go from AIDS to the L word? They were talking about coming out in the late 80s and early 90s at a time where now everyone was going to AA meetings. One of my participants comes out in the early 90s and she's like, it wasn't even cool to go to the bar. I met people by going to AA meetings, and I wasn't an alcoholic. And I was like,
Yeah.
that's a way to cruise and when you're a
Yeah,
teenager. Yeah.
absolutely. The culture of drinking radically changes in the
Yeah.
80s. And it sort of,
Yeah.
and we begin to see the early stages of that in the 70s with awareness of alcoholism, and gay bars are culpable for, sort of profiting off of and contributing to queer maladjustment and alcoholism and substance abuse. Like that's part of the story. But it isn't
Yeah.
necessarily things that replace it.
Right. And it doesn't go away. In the 90s, when I looked at all these national and local New York City lesbi queer trans publications, all of the ads were from alcohol. Like, it's like, here's another Absolute ad and Bud Light and Jägermeister. And right, that's who's paying for our ability to
Right.
connect and have magazines and have documentation.
Yeah.
And the other side of it is talk about like all the caretaking, but all the activism groups like ACT UP, and so many. There's just a plethora of organizations, dozens and dozens of them. We hear about ACT UP, but there were so many people organizing, and they're doing that at night, and they're not doing that in a bar, right?
Yeah, so there's a massive cultural shift that happens. There is some symbiosis. So bars become a place where we're doing benefits and fundraisers for AIDS service organizations, or maybe you go dancing after the protest. But there's definitely a displacement or a decentering of bars that happens culturally.
And that had happened earlier for Dykes, right? Because the 70s, we had this huge lesbian world building. We're going to have bookstores. We're going to have
Right.
restaurants. We're going to have cafes. Right,
Coffee
exactly. And that,
shops
that
and yeah.
happened
Yeah.
for the gay boys too. But
Right.
lesbian bars still key. Softball. Dykes can't have
Hmm.
softball without a bar to
Yeah,
sponsor them. But now the 80s, it's a major shift.
exactly.
You're right. You're so right.
So one of the things that we see happening in the late 80s is there's an interest in reviving, but also really importantly reimagining nightlife in new ways that are sort of generational. So it's marking this is for a new generation. Sometimes it's about a new model of inclusion. Sort of, we want spaces that are co-gender or multi-gender or multiracial and multi-ethnic, where we can bring the community together. It no longer makes sense for a dance club to be segregated. Maybe one of the most interesting phenomena that emerges is a wave of women's and lesbian parties that are saying, like, why can't we have what the gay boys have had since the 70s? We want our own dance clubs and discos,
Amen.
and we want sexy
Yes.
spaces.
What's super interesting about this moment in the 80s and the 90s is that it is true. San Francisco and also London are having these super sexy party scenes of actual sex. I cannot enthusiastically recommend enough the documentary Rebel Dykes about London dyke squatters, activists, and holders of this incredibly fun looking BDSM sex party, Chain Reaction, which lasted for years. But what I also learned watching that, and I hadn't heard this before, is that there were dykes from London flying to San Francisco to go to those parties. So these ideas are cross pollinating across these different locations. And what gets launched in San Francisco in 1984 is the incredible sexy magazine On Our Backs. Yes, the title's perfect. This is really kind of post porn / sex wars, claiming the body, putting on the page, showing self-made pornography. Coming up, I want to talk a little bit about temporality. So sit with this question for a second. Why would you decide to throw a giant party rather than opening a bar in the middle of the early years of the AIDS crisis? And I say early years because AIDS is still with us, and until it's gone, it's always a crisis. But why a party and not a bar? The answer is really, you would of course decide to throw an all-out super party for one night or a few months rather than open a long-term bar, because you don't know if you and your friends are going to be there to go to the bar. You want the party that is now. You want the super awesome event.
This coincides with the emergence of what came to be called lipstick lesbian culture or lesbian chic, where it was sort of a reclaiming of the glamour, the sexiness, the urbanity that the gay boys had really sort of claimed as theirs culturally. In the absence of these gay clubs, there's real estate available for these parties to take over these spaces, and they don't have long-term leases, but they become this kind of event-based rather than everyday or routine quotidian spaces. And some of these parties continued monthly or weekly for over a decade. San Francisco is really where I found the biggest explosion, both of the sheer number of parties, but also public reporting and attention and debate about them. And so these parties actually became kind of the way to talk about this sort of new imagining of a generational shift, but also a cultural and political shift from gay to queer.
For those of you who don't know what lesbian chic is at this moment, in 1993, Newsweek puts out an article saying that lesbian chic has arrived. And these very white, middle upper class, kind of acceptable, norming lesbians. And at the same time, Vanity Fair puts out the cover, which if you haven't seen, we will absolutely have on our Instagram. It is smoking hot, with Cindy Crawford crawling all over Katie Lang and giving her a kind of pseudo shave. It's the heart of sexy. But there was a lot of pushback against lesbian chic and a real kind of different way of making lesbian chic in San Francisco that was queering it as well. Yeah, and so the box. I've heard about Club Q, but never the box. So let's talk
Yes.
wow to start. Yes. Wow.
Yeah, so Club Q and the Box were both parties where Paige Hodel DJ'd. And so she emerged in San Francisco as one of the leading party DJs. And I just kept seeing references to her parties and ads for her parties, and they just sounded like the greatest parties ever.
What Lucas writes about Paige Hodel, and yes, there will definitely be pictures on Queer Geographies, is so good that I need to read it to you. Mixtress Paige Hodel provided the beating heart of this co-gender party movement. Hodel was born during the later days of the baby boom, but was a bridge figure with the new queer generation. She worked at the lesbian bar Amelia's, at the Dyke March, at the Folsom Street Fair, which is the leather fair, at political events, for the soul radio station KSOL, on Olivia Cruises, the lesbian cruises, and at a range of recurring events, including her signature parties at The Box and Club Q. Hodel had unparalleled reach in the venues where she built a following. She spun records at straight clubs, black clubs, punk clubs, gay male clubs, and women's clubs. Her wide-ranging audiences followed her and converged at The Box, which not only had a diverse crowd, but was also more multi-generational than the other parties. On The Box's first night, 450 dancers showed up. The following week, 1,300 did so. The Box was initially scheduled on Thursdays at the Kennel Club, and within a few months expanded to Saturdays as well. A flyer produced for Hodel's last night DJing the party after 11 years, 572 Thursdays, it calculated, recalled, on April 7th, 1988, I opened a dance club called The Box. I began with a dream of a dance club where gay men and women of all colors and their friends could come together and share a love for deliciously sweet, soulful dance music. I began with a dream that I could start a club where everyone who entered would be treated with respect and dignity that I feel we so deeply deserve. That I would create a club where we could grow and thrive as a community and learn together what the word community meant. As we removed our clothes and danced into the night, our bodies glistening with sweat, close and connected, the music and our sweat, the conduit that joined us. And it worked. Lucas goes on to say that virtually every published account of The Box mentions sweat, which I just love, the physicality and the intimacy. Hodel also said, DJing is like making love. It's very intimate and an exchange of energy back and forth. You find the sweet spot, and I am fanatic about giving pleasure to the audience. Paige Hodel, what a nugget. Going back to this moment of the super party and why this is different than parties before, this is an intergender and interracial dance party. That is different. Sure, there have been parties happening in different places and times, but having them over and over again for 572 Thursdays, as well as some Saturdays, is a phenomenon. The other reason this is happening is not just Paige Hodel, though. It's AIDS. This really intergenerational moment of these incredible parties also has something to do with having a greater purpose and feeling a deep sense of community and activism.
The bars and parties I read about in the book are not necessarily things I would have wanted to go to. I wasn't writing about my taste in bars. I was writing about things that sort of help define certain cultures. The box is probably the number one thing I would have wanted to experience uh, that I read
I
about.
would have
Yeah.
loved the box.
Yeah.
Like the nonstop dancing,
The
the
one,
just the
yeah.
everyone's there,
Yeah.
the everything gender.
Everyone's
Yeah.
there.
And Paige Hodel is still DJing. What an elder queen.
Mhm.
You can also go to her woodworking
Yes.
group. How dykey is that?
She is someone who had DJ'd across different kinds of scenes and became this cross section where people were following the DJ and all converged at this party called the Box, which survived for many years. It moved spaces where there were two dance floors with different
Mm,
music, changed the culture because people were no longer all
yeah.
together. But in the early days, when everyone was together on the dance floor, and it's really about sort of this late 80s, early 90s moment of house music and soul music. This is happening concurrently with the rise of these new women's dance parties. So, Club Q being the most famous version of that in the Bay Area. What I would call proto Club Kid parties like Club Uranus and other kind of parties that are embracing kind of freakery, gender fuck, um, sort of druggy, alternative, alien perversions in ways that are very, very playful and that are specific to the Bay Area. So San Francisco becomes a real center of reimagining queer nightlife in this moment. A lot of cities have maybe one or two parties that resemble this to a certain extent, but not the same level of public discourse around it or sort of sheer number of parties that are doing
Yeah.
this in this moment. Part of it is also about real estate in San Francisco at this moment. So it's post earthquake, the one that sort of collapsed the Bay Bridge, and the city was economically devastated. And there was real estate and warehouses that were available to just be taken over. And it's really the internet, the .com bubble that changes the economics of the city that no longer makes that possible from the late 90s onwards. But there's this kind of the golden ages in terms of nightlife. That's one of them that's very exciting to me.
Yeah, the 1989 earthquake, I remember watching. We all watched it a little bit live if you were watching the World Series. It actually
Hmm.
happens in the middle of the World Series, and
Yeah.
it was so overwhelming. So to think of San Francisco as affordable, I'm sure is flooring most of you. To be economically
Y-
devastated, this is the
Yes.
last moment where San Francisco is
Yes.
affordable.
Yeah.
Briefly, the .com bubble was the first attempt to make an internet, produced a lot of stocks for companies that totally failed. There was this horrible company, Amazon, that sadly survived, but they got financially wiped out. As for club kids, these are youthful people who go clubbing. We also have tons of raves happening in the 90s. We have tons of drugs happening in the 90s. And we have tons of people who are going straight edge in the 90s. I deeply recommend listening to the 90s and aughts episode that includes Catherine Griffiths, the DJ, who is an expert on the history of the London lesbian music party and dance scene. Now we're going to talk about the shift from our idealized narratives of HIV/AIDS to more complex ones. The story we usually hear about lesbians and gay men during the AIDS epidemic is that there were many lesbians who took care of gay men. There were many lesbians involved in activism. But that certainly wasn't all of them. And you reference that as bringing dykes and fags back together again and connecting and seeing each other's humanity and wanting to even share a space again.
Yeah, and I really think that it is one of the things that really does bring the community back
Yeah.
together. I give a lot of credit to women who were doing a lot of both the activism of putting their bodies on the line to be arrested or to protest, but also doing a lot of the caretaking work in ways that I will be totally honest, like the gay guys really didn't reciprocate.
Still haven't. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. There was a way in which it really did bring communities together that had been politically and culturally pretty separated in the 70s and 80s up until then. Interestingly, Sarah Schulman in her tome about ACT UP, one of the things that she sort of challenges is this notion of women were caretakers. And she's like, well, men did the caretaking too.
Like the Record Show is such an incredible book. Conveniently, Sarah Schulman is in our next 2 episodes. Enjoy!
In my mind, I understand the box and these dance parties as a kind of cathartic release of, or just an opportunity to experience joy
Yeah.
and to be together in a time of profound loss and grief. It's that duality that is what makes this period so special. So not to be
No.
nostalgic for what was a truly horrible time, but that activism, that caretaking, that moment of crisis is what brought people together.
So many people of that era have always told me I was going to a funeral a week, and just the heartbreakingness and the loss
Mhm.
and the stories they tell.
Yeah, we begin to see discourses of queerness and the sins of a new generation that doesn't want to be defined by the 70s model of lesbian separatism, nor of the gay male clone, that wants to reimagine a more inclusive queerness.
Everything we're talking about reminds me of Marika Seafor's concept of vital nostalgia, which she calls a generative practice for interrogating, addressing, and repairing structural power inequities grounded in that bittersweet longing for a pastime or space. So many people put down nostalgia as idealizing, over romanticizing, not dealing with the critical past. But my friend Marika is coming back and saying, listen, actually, it's alive. And what she's basing this on as a person who teaches and studies queer archives is her decade plus of work looking at AIDS archives and how people build exhibits about them. And you might be saying, Jack Giesking, what's a clone? Well, there was a lesbian feminist style, right? You remember it was a bit like sometimes cottagecore, everybody's growing out their body hair. But at the same time, the gay boys, specifically mostly white gay boys, created the Castro clone. So you would wear a tight white t-shirt, a tight jeans so everyone could see your bits, and a very thick mustache, kind of in the order of Magnum PI. By the way, it was Sarah Schulman who wrote that it was not lesbians who kept people out of their spaces. It was gay men who were the separatists. Not until the HIV AIDS crisis grows and grows, and there's a recognition of how much labor and care is coming from dykes, that these spaces either start to integrate or lesbians and gay men who want to work together create their own spaces. Also, Lucas had just said before is so important. I'm going to play it again because we need to talk about reclaiming the word queer. It had been largely derogatory until the 80s when activist groups started taking it back and claiming it as a go fuck yourselves. You can't talk about us that way.
We begin to see discourses of queerness and the sins of a new generation that doesn't want to be defined by the 70s model of lesbian separatism, nor of the gay male clone, that wants to reimagine a more inclusive queerness.
That was a huge part of reclaiming queer. For those of you who don't know, queer was such a derogatory term at this time. It was a word that no one
Mhm.
was using. And it's groups like ACT UP and other activist groups throughout the 80s, into the group Queer Nation in 1990 and the Lesbian Avengers in the early 90s, who are part of taking these terms back. The document Queers Read This, given out at the New York City, I think 1990 or 1989 Pride Parade, which then inspires the creation of Queer Nation, was about anger, was about all this
Yeah.
loss and taking it back. So this kind of queerness and this determination to live, this vitality, is it's so beautiful. There's a sentence you write that I would like to say about Club Q. But other publicity for Club Q cultivated a lesbian chic aesthetic, featured images of female bodybuilders, and promoted playful events such as bra parties and twister games, which we really need to come back.
One of the goals of the book is that it turns people on. And for me, the sexiest image in the book is a promotion for the party called Skirts.
I'm looking at it right now.
Which, like, that I find like more arousing than anything else in the book. It's a reclamation for that lesbians can be sexy and that they don't have to conform to a notion of sort of granola, but like you can be fluid and sexy and chic.
And actually make granola sexy, which was San Francisco
Yeah,
worked
yeah,
really hard on that eventually.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but not yet. Next up, we get to talk about how dyke havens mix boys and girls and transes and NBs of the time in places like Club Q. As for what the Skirts ad looks like, though, of course, I will put it online. We're also going to talk about Annie Sprinkle, and I will definitely mention Amber Hollowell. Both of them had worked as sex workers, while Annie being much more of a performer and Amber being much more of a writer. Susie Bright is going to show up, Susie Sexpert, as she was also known. And not to be missed, Cherry Morega was also writing about sex. There's an awesome article I will make sure you have access to called What We're Rolling Around in Bed With by Amber Hollowell and Cherry Morega. Sexual Silences and Feminism.
San Francisco was really the place that I found the deepest archive of reimagining queer. It was fascinating to find them in the archive because it was like, oh, this is where my entire worldview of what queer is comes from. And I was like, this is the world I
Yeah.
inherited. And my whole worldview makes sense now. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so important to go in these archives and then be like, "Oh, where did we come from? Oh,
Yeah.
did we really want to do that? We can do it differently."
Right.
Realizing why people make choices.
Right.
I love that there were t-shirts that said dancing is safe sex. I don't want to miss this incredible quote describing San Francisco. A Sentinel cover proclaimed, "Gay men get intimate while lesbians learn to lust. San Francisco, which Annie Sprinkle called the clitoris of America, became an important center for these new dyke cultures." It's so exciting and invigorating. I've always heard about this kind of queer San Francisco, especially through the writings of somebody like Michelle T. But
Hmm.
this is an entirely different way to like take them in and to see like how the zines are playing out and the t-shirt culture and the punk and how it's all happening together all at once.
Right. And I think in retrospect, we realize these were all happening simultaneously, but we don't think of lesbian chic and club kids as being from the same moment and being proximate. Valencia by Michelle T opens on the dance floor getting jostled around by the guys at the party. And it's like, oh, this is this world.
Michelle T is brilliant and hilarious, who's written incredible memoirs and books. One of my favorite quotes from her is, "I will meet you in the dirtiest city you can dream of. We will drink cocktails so sweet they pucker our cheeks. As we perch on cracked leather bar stools, I will buy you plates of calcium and protein. And we will run through the streets in excellent danger." That is such a thoughtful thing to do, given that we are inclined to osteoporosis and we do need our protein. There's something so earnestly dykey and sexy and queer about that. Now it's time to turn to those amazing dyke bars that Lucas has personally known.
I will say,
Oh, yes.
speaking of Dallas, I will say the greatest lesbian bar I've ever been to was in Dallas.
Ooh, which one? Tell us. Tell us.
um, Sue Ellen's,
Oh.
which I just love. It's named after the character on the TV show Dallas. There's JR's, and then around the corner is Sue Ellen's.
And you can still go. It's still open. One of the magical bars that's still there.
And it's the only lesbian bar I've been to that is like a true nightclub. It's two stories. The night I was there was like hard hip hop on the dance floor when you enter, and then we went upstairs and there was live bluegrass music happening, and then on the other side was karaoke. So there was like all these different worlds and soundscapes and genres, and the sounds would kind of blend into each other. If you looked outside on the deck, some women were playing like lawn Jenga. So it was just like the most perfect cross section of like lesbian possibility, kind of amazing way.
That sounds beautiful. I have never been there, and it is on my top list of places to go is Dallas, which is um, usually
Yeah.
striking. That's awesome. When we think about gay bars, lesbian bars, trans hangouts, trans bars, all the parties, this key moment we're talking about from the 80s or 90s, what do you think of as a national landscape? We talked about how San Francisco is different. What's happening in the rest of the US?
In the late 90s, there was this emergent discourse of gay bars are the same everywhere that kind of bemoaned the kind of standardization of gay scenes across the country. This is the kind of like post Ellen, early Will and Grace days. The sense of like, oh, well, so now we're too
Right.
normal. There's a kind of legible gay market where suddenly, condo developers are marketing to gay readers in the
Mm-hmm.
magazines at gay bars. But in the early 90s, part of that is economic, with like the sort of Clinton neoliberal economic moment, economic boom that happens that we forget about,
And a gay voting block,
and a
right?
gay
Like
voting bloc.
Clinton goes after us as an actual voting block.
We're recognized as a valuable market and as a voting bloc, but we don't actually have real rights or
No.
or other enfranchisement. It's the sort of pandering and marketization that happens concurrent with the rise of the internet as a kind of major cultural and social form that shifts things. People were traveling, and so certain cities or certain bars or certain parties begin to mirror each other. But I think that there was still a sense of place and a sense of a local culture. Even to the extent that there's certain national trends, most cities by the 70s have at least one leather bar. By the
Right.
90s, we have at least one drag venue. Drag had kind of fallen out of favor during the 70s and early 80s, but it really becomes recentered largely, I believe, around these AIDS benefits, because it was the drag queens who were emceeing and doing these gigs for
Hmm.
fundraising. They became kind of reclaimed as these kind of community heroes, doing a lot of the work of supporting the community.
Now let's turn to Lucas's brilliant take on how the LGBTQ economy and geography shifted as he did his research, as lesbian bars closed even more, and then many opened, and as finally gay bars started to close in significant numbers for the first time in history.
So I think that there's still some local differences, and even in my travels in the aughts and the 20 teens, sort of the local economics really do influence what's happening. And so when I was traveling, people kept saying these kind of homogenizing things about like the gay bars dying or the culture's moved on, but it's like that wasn't true
No,
everywhere. Every city I've lived in, the bars still get crowded. But if you travel to other cities where it's a, sort of Detroit or Cleveland, the scene is very different. In Detroit, spatially, the bars are just really far away from each other. Like there's a kind of dispersion of, so there's not a sense in the city proper of sort of a physical sort of neighborhood. You have to go to the suburbs there. And I think it's the only city I can think of where you go to the suburbs for the gay community. In Cleveland, just the struggle of any business surviving changes the dynamics of the gay bar. So that's a fundamentally different thing than Los Angeles or New York or Minneapolis or Atlanta or other places that have like a different thing happening.
yeah, and these things go in hand with, like when you're talking about gay bars, we're also talking about the lesbian bars that start closing in the early
Yeah.
90s, but really in larger numbers in the late 90s. The gay press is writing about them. People are starting to notice, and there's a discourse of,
Yeah.
it's closed now. And the other thing that's happening in the early 90s that's worth mentioning, that's really beautiful, is it is pre-internet, but we do have our earnest bulletin board systems. For you
Hmm.
guys who don't know what that is, it's like calling on your local dial-up. Call in to this a local phone number, and hopefully your parents wouldn't pick up the phone and knock you off. But you would be able to find maybe other queer people, pornography, games, history. Download a copy of Lady Chatterley's Lovers. I did and found it very boring and never finished it. But as you're doing that, there were also these groups called Usenet, and Avery Dame Griff has written beautifully in The Two Revolutions, A History of the Transgender Internet, about how these Usenet groups actually helped to form, so importantly, the early trans movement that comes out of this. Because how are trans
Yeah.
people going to find one another? They're in these segregated, segmented bars and spaces. They're being treated in certain ways in these bars, but being in the private space of the home, being able to talk to one another and admit things. Maybe you don't go out in public, but you can talk and you can read about other people out there like you, and that's giving a lot of people energy to go out and find one another too, and that's also helping and surging this gender fuckery of this period as well.
And it's a great book.
It is such a great book. And now we're going to get back to lesbian bars and their history.
When I first started sort of working on the book, there were two most common responses from people I was meeting as I was traveling for research. So one was people would say, "Well, the gay bar is dying or dead," and I'd be like, "But we are
Oh
at a gay
yeah.
bar having this conversation." So there, that's not totally true.
Absolutely heard that.
But the other one was this question of, "Are you going to write about lesbian bars?"
Mm.
And my approach was always kind of twofold with that. So there is a cultural specificity to the gay male bar that doesn't sort of conflate gay bars and lesbian bars as having a cultural specificity, but also the term gay bar often is used as an umbrella term for all of these different kinds of queer spaces, some of which aren't even bars. It was important that women, including straight women, lesbians, trans men, are all present in the book because they're present in these spaces.
Right.
But they may not be sort of the dominant cultural force or definition of these spaces because that's not how they were lived. My approach to the bars has really tried to reflect kind of the human messiness of these spaces. They're very porous. They're ambivalent. They can be life-changing and open up possibilities. They can be terrible places of rejection, sexual harm, substance abuse, like sort
Yeah.
of all kinds of things happen in these spaces. And it was important to me that I wasn't only celebratory nor a critique, but that like we understand that this was the primary venue of queer public life. And so it has all of that messiness, and all of these people are in these spaces, even if sometimes they're not imagined to be for a particular segment of that population.
Yeah, I remember that I had two participants show up who came out actually in this period we're going to talk about, late 80s, early 90s,
Mhm.
and they were both like, "Listen, I hated acoustic rock. I couldn't
Yeah,
stand folk music. I was not going to a
exactly.
dyke bar, even though that's not exactly what they always played there, but they were really into techno. They were really into dancing
Hmm.
all night long, sweaty, having a party, and there were so many dykes who went to those sorts of spaces." And there
Hmm.
start to be a shift in these parties, and we're going to talk about that. But yeah, that those people get like left out of history because they don't fit a certain kind of music, a certain
Yeah.
kind of present gender presentation. Yeah, and we lose all that, and it's so important to grab it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Both people and the past are never as homogenous as we want to imagine they are. Not every lesbian liked folk music or women's music. Not every gay man likes techno, or
Yes.
opera. These are sort of convenient cultural tropes, but lived experiences is different from that. And I think one of the things we've seen historically is most cities had one, maybe two lesbian bars, and they were never proportionate to the population though relative to what gay
Never.
bars were. So you might have a dozen gay male bars for each lesbian venue. And I've seen a lot of explanations, both economic and social, for why they never had sort of equivalent numbers. So the most common explanation is just sort of if they make 70 cents on the dollar, they don't have the same disposable income. But also, I mean, one of the other elements to me that's really compelling is real estate again. Women tended to not live near the bars in the ways that men did. So when you have these gay neighborhoods, the rents are higher,
Yeah.
and men are more likely to either be able to afford it or to be willing to pay for rent close to these entertainment districts in ways that women either didn't have those options or made the different choices. So when we could talk about cruising bars, the cruising wasn't necessarily with the goal of settling down, and women, sort of the cliche is like the women who may hook up at the bar but then they couple.
Now this cliche is going to bring us to my favorite lesbian joke, because wait for it, it is actually a joke about queer geographies. What does a lesbian take on a second date?
A U-Haul, yes.
Right, exactly. And what does a gay man take on a second date? Have you ever heard this one?
I don't know that one, no.
Oh, what second date?
Exactly.
Right, and they're reductive, but they're true,
They're
right? Yeah,
true.
there's a pattern of doing this.
And
Yeah.
so there's not the same repeat business because sort of, you hook up, you couple, and then you don't come back to the bar until you break up. So,
Yeah. And if you've got like elder care, child care, you're
right,
volunteering, you're making less
definitely.
money,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. And
Yeah,
the sense of public space, like
right,
women in public space, really until something like the aughts, like the
right.
amount of lighting that came into cities. There's so many studies that say women, very generally speaking,
Hmm.
feel safe when there's a lot of lighting.
Yeah,
There was not a lot of lighting in cities. They were very
right.
dark. The expectation that you were going to be attacked, raped,
Hmm.
mugged, murdered. Yeah.
Right.
And this is the kind of thing we still see about what happened to women in cities, but we
Yeah.
have different ideas now.
And especially, I mean, at least until the 90s and even into the 90s, I mean, gay bars and lesbian bars were typically in low rent districts that were either
Yes.
deindustrialized or they're deliberately sort of out of public view. They're often unmarked. And so the spaces around these bars were largely untrafficked, and, sort of city streets are less safe. There's fewer people observing and sort of protecting people through those observations. So both lighting and sort of depopulation of these of these areas, and sort of the discreetness which allowed people to sort of be unseen going to and from these venues, which is important if people are in the closet or were at risk of losing their jobs or being arrested. But also, it did make these spaces less safe as a sort of urban environment.
Yeah.
And so all of those things so definitely contribute to sort of the disparities in terms of the options women had for these spaces.
There's dyke wisdom in where we put our places, where we could afford to, where we wanted to go, where we didn't want to go, and how much they cost, what kind of music we play. How many Black queer women spaces have been in industrial spaces? Where have Latinx, Indigenous, and Native and Asian spaces been placed? Why are they not publicized? Because they don't want to be targeted. They might not be able to come out to their families. And this gets back to the U-Haul joke and the wisdom within. I will tell you that I used to just find this funny. Isn't that a lesbian trope? Ha ha ha. And then in the midst of my research, one of my participants turned to me and said, it's really hard to find someone to be with. The city's so expensive. I love New York, but I can't afford to live here. When you find someone so amazing and you really want to connect with them, and of course, lesbian sex takes hours and hours, and you just want to keep being with them and you keep wanting to know them, you move in together. You want to create that special world in a shitty, cis, hetero, white, ableist patriarchy. And I realized I had been making fun of us all along. I mean, it is a funny joke. We're a trope. But at the same time, too, it's telling us about why we operate in these ways. Now, on the other half, for gay men, there's a cultural norm among gay men that they shouldn't have a second date. There's the possibility of always the next person, always something different. And Grindr, by the way, has wildly intensified that for gay men. Speaking of cruising, you want to hear about it, right? Of course you do. I do too. That's why I asked Lucas about it. Oh, please, Lucas Hilderbrand, will you tell us a little bit about cruising in the bars?
Sure. So I think one of the myths, and more me just knowing people and hearing people's stories than sort of anything in the archive, but like gay men primarily used bars for cruising and for hooking up and for public sex, and that women didn't. It's my strongly held conviction that women were just as likely to hook up in bars and perhaps more likely to hook up in bar bathrooms than men were.
The number of times that Meow Mix had to replace its sink, multiple times, Meow Mix in the 1990s. In fact, when they built Caddyshack, when the owner of Meow Mix moved there, they made sure that the bathroom in Caddyshack supported 800 pounds. So that, like, in case there was a massive hookup, because everyone's fucking on the bathroom sink and taking it out. Yeah. Oh, so expensive, guys.
Yeah. And so whether it was not sort of on the radar or there just wasn't a discourse or whether it was just sort of more of a community secret. But like, yeah, I mean, women were hooking up and cruising just as much as men were, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. When I interview people for A Queer New York, I would say, what was cruising? And they would say making eye contact. And it's a different mentality. And when we talk to the people I was interviewing, like, why didn't we fuck in the Ramble of Central Park? Why weren't we on the waterfronts? And one of my participants finally wisely said, she'd come out in the 80s, I didn't want to lay down there. And I said, oh my God, like literally the geography of a hookup and an orgasm, lying down versus standing up, the psychology of an orgasm versus the physicality, all these dimensions of how cruising gets shaped are things we haven't talked about yet. And I think when we do, we'll be like, oh, we have been cruising. We have been doing it a lot.
Yeah. I mean, my assumption would be that you feel much safer doing this in a bar bathroom than you would out in a public space where like you're more likely to be found or arrested for these kinds of things. But also like as a prissy gay myself, it's like I don't want to get dirty. Like I'd rather do it indoors.
Well done. Yeah.
Or like I'm like, oh, the gravel would hurt. Like wouldn't
yes, you get rug burn, you get little gravel burn on your back or your bum.
Or like thistles or pine needles or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of reasons people make the choices they make.
Yes.
But,
yeah. Very cool. Thank you so much. What a gift. Thank you for this chat and for the bars are ours, because the bars are ours, everyone.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. And the parties too.
The parties too.
Have more of them. Keep making them, everyone. And thank you so much, Lucas.
Yeah, thank you so much.
What a happy ending. So, of course, we're talking about cruising as being about where you want to lay down or not in a park, but also waterfronts at the time until very recently were very dirty places. But as one of my wonderful interns pointed out to me, Picnic tables, on the other hand, are just wonderful places to find one another in the middle of a park. Of course, I not only talk to my participants, but I have talked to probably well over 1,000 dykes of all different persuasions about their takes on cruising. And the thing that keeps coming up is I at least would want to know someone's name. Consent that has incredibly come out of the feminist movement, of work among lesbians and trans people, queer people. Knowing someone's name for a lot of people is a way of a kind of a consent and recognition. That said, cruising, the outdoor kind, is quite hot. We had a wonderful time with Lucas. The bars are ours, just like Lucas's book title says. It's a chunk of good queer history. Thank you all. I hope you are well and safe and with those you love and those who love you. You absolutely deserve it. Look forward to more Dyke Histories. Here they come. Thanks for tuning in to Our Dyke Histories in collaboration with Sinister Wisdom. Do share Our Dyke Histories with your friends, colleagues, fellow students, exes, crushes, or heck, use it as a pickup line when you don't know what to say in a bar. Good luck to you, brother, sister, and themster. You can easily connect with us on Instagram or Facebook at Our Dyke Histories, and come and follow me, Jack Giesking, via my newsletter, Queer Geographies, at queergeographies.com, which is packed with all the images that accompany the transcripts from all of our episodes, and many more tales of dyke bars, queer parties, trans hangouts, as well as a myriad of other queer spaces and queries like, do dykes cruise? I have data. Never stop loving on all things Sinister Wisdom. At sinisterwisdom.org, you can subscribe, buy their books, or make a donation. Now on to our credits. We are a small but mighty team. Our Dyke Histories is recorded, edited, and produced by Jack Giesking, and co-edited and co-produced by Cade Waldo. Our social media is designed and managed by Audrey Wilkinson. Our theme song, Like Honey, was graciously gifted to us from Kit Orion at kitorion.com. Interns for the show include Becca Moses and Sophie McLean, with additional input from Rachel Fagan. We're forever grateful to our co-producer Julie Enzer and the entire team at Sinister Wisdom, publishing since 1976. Sinister Wisdom recognizes the power of language to reflect diverse, multicultural lesbian experiences and to enhance our ability to develop critical judgment. As lesbians evaluating our community and our world, we share our dyke histories so we know more about who we are, how we were, and what we fight to never forget. Let's keep doing it, y'all.